the Dickensians worried so wearily about Dickens, about where he went to school, about where he ate his dinners, about how he wore his trousers and when he cut his hair. I used to wonder why they did not write something that I could read about a man like Micawber. That's one of Dickens' larger-than-life characters. But I have come to the conclusion, Chesterton continues, and now he's inching toward that self-revelation. I have come to the conclusion that this almost hysterical worship of the man, combined with a comparatively feeble criticism of his works, is just and natural. Dickens was a man, like ourselves. We can study him without being stunned or getting sunstroke. But Micawber is not a man. Micawber is the Superman. We can only walk round and round him wondering what we shall say. All the critics of Dickens, when all is done, have only walked round and round Micawber, wondering what they should say. I am myself at this moment walking round and round Micawber, wondering what I shall say. Well, and thus does Chesterton describe the predicament of anyone who would attempt to talk about Chesterton. It's not that admirers of Chesterton are almost hysterical, or that they ignore his works and wonder about his haircuts. Rather, students of Chesterton admit to being stunned and sunburned. They love to talk about both the man and his books, but they know, we know, that any amount of talk falls so far short of the genius, the fertility of his mind, that the temptation is simply, I was talking about this just a few moments ago, the temptation is simply to revert to reading the man himself. Just read Chesterton. For us, Chesterton is a kind of Superman who can teach academic Thomists essential things about Aquinas they have never seen, tell surprised poets the meaning of their own poems, explain marriage or work or love of home to an era that cannot imagine these realities right before its nose. For all his genuine humility, Chesterton remains a kind of colossus of insight, before whose varied writings I walk, round and round in wonder. This acuity of insight is nowhere more evident, of course, than in his writings about the Catholic faith. Chesterton famously accuses himself of being absent-minded. And if we're talking about mistaking a train station for a coffee shop or a corkscrew for his house keys, actual events, then the accusation seems just. But when it comes to the matter of faith, Chesterton reveals what has to be called a profound presence of mind, precisely because the truths of the faith and the contours of his own imagination and reasoning seem so parallel. Though he came into the church from a background broad to the point he hardly called it Protestant, he was raised in something of a Unitarian Universalist home. It is as if his apprehensions and sensibilities were always ready for the teachings of the faith. Now, one has to be careful in speaking about this, of course. A Catholic is not a type. Properly, Catholicism is not a thing for certain tastes, proclivities, or personalities. Whether or not James Joyce was really referring to the Catholic Church when he says, "Here comes everybody," fashion, the epithet is nevertheless apt enough. Yet Chesterton's mind grasped Catholic truths before he even knew they were Catholic. When I called just now the contours of his own imagination, Chesterton more poetically described as soils for the seeds of doctrine. And in the closing paragraph of one of his chapters in Orthodoxy, this is the Ethics of Elfland, he lists a number of these features. I felt in my bones that this world does not explain itself. It may be a miracle with a supernatural explanation. It may be a conjuring trick with a natural explanation. But the explanation of the conjuring trick, if it is to satisfy me, will have to be better than the natural explanations I have heard. The thing is magic, true or false. Second, I came to feel as if magic must have a meaning, and meaning must have someone to mean it. There was something personal in the world, as in a work of art. Whatever it meant violently. Third, I thought this purpose beautiful in its old design, in spite of defects, such as dragons. Fourth, that the proper form of thanks to it is some form of humility and restraint. We should thank God for beer and burgundy by not drinking too much of them. We owed also an obedience to whatever made us. And last and strangest, there had come to my mind a vague and vast impression that in some way all good was a remnant to be stored and held sacred out of some primordial ruin. Man had saved his goods as Robinson Crusoe had saved his goods. He saved them from a wreck. All this I felt, and the age gave me no encouragement to feel it. And all this time I had not even thought of Christian theology. The passage is a remarkable one, and not just because Chesterton seems to intuit doctrines like creation and the fall, and does so before knowing they are Christian teachings. It is remarkable because his sense that the world does not explain itself reaches beyond the hunch that the world is merely contingent. Instead, the universe looks like a miraculous act, a deliberate deed, shot through with meaning, import, significance, and limitless value. Moreover, in anticipation of points Flannery O'Connor would later emphasize, that meaning was intense, violent, wild, beyond our ability to tame or drop wholly formulated into books. This is to say, he senses that the meaning is mysterious as well as imperative. Note also the integration or linking of things like beauty and morality to the ground of being or metaphysics. We ought not drink too much because we are grateful for the existence of drink. We owe our Maker obedience because being brought into existence results in an unpayable debt. Obedience, then, is a feeble thank you we offer for the gift of being. Beauty, too, participates in this metaphysical plenty, as creation's intense meaning and beauty are inseparable. Far from being some decorative doily draped atop existence, beauty suffuses creation so entirely, so completely, that even the primordial ruin Chesterton mentions cannot conceal it. While one could argue that all these tightly packed implications are present in the passage by virtue of an older, wiser, more theologically informed Chesterton, that argument, in fact, would be untrue, both to the text itself and to Chesterton's abundantly demonstrated habits of mind. He notes that these intimations were with him well before he could write or even reason much at all. Whatever absent-mindedness afflicted the adult Chesterton, the present to his mind from an early age were these intimations richly characteristic of Catholic teachings and understanding. None of this, however, should suggest that Chesterton was a crypto-Catholic in childhood and from there moved in a toward the church. Our purpose here is not biography, but we should note that Chesterton's adolescence and early adulthood saw him drawn to philosophies and metaphysical speculations that, to a degree frightening even to himself, were as dark, skeptical, and even diabolical, that's his term, as one could wish. I dug quite low enough, he says, to discover the devil, and even in some dim way to recognize the devil. I made his acquaintance by my own fault, and followed it along lines which, had they been followed further, might have led me to devil worship. But when people say, evil is only relative, sin is only negative, there is no positive badness, it is only the absence of positive goodness, then I know they are talking shallow balderdash only because they are much better men than I, more innocent and more normal and more near to God. Chesterton knew from experience not only the reality of evil in the world, but the appalling depths of fundamental skepticism and solipsism, he says, that pulled one philosophically into an inescapable black hole and severed one practically from every moral anchor. In a famous essay, I'm sure many here have read it, called The Diabolist, he recounts a conversation he had as a young man with another youth who calmly embodied this morally unmoored state. With no bravado or even particular intensity, that youth argued that what the world considered evil, he took as, in fact, good. A few moments later, the two having parted, Chesterton chanced to notice a different companion proposing something to that youth, something that Chesterton could not hear. But he could hear the companion affirm, "Nobody can possibly know." The youth then replied in a fashion that literally sent Chesterton fleeing. "I tell you, I have done everything else. If I do that, I shan't know the difference between right and wrong." Okay, granted, while this remark perhaps does not live up to contemporary Hollywood standards for melodramatic terror, the depth and import of it were too keenly felt by Chesterton. The conversation occurred not long after he had himself felt the terrible pull of a kind of moral solipsism and had seen how simply available, immediate, evil could be if one wanted it. He later called that quiet conversation, and these are Chesterton's words, "the most terrible thing that has ever happened to me in my life." And in that remark, we see how interesting the reality of evil is in Chesterton's moral vision. We also see how foolish it is to regard him, as is so often regarded, as some naive, wishfully thinking, happy warrior. Chesterton was attracted to Catholicism, not sent to it in terror, but he approvingly quotes his wife as replying, "the devil," whenever she was asked who was responsible for her conversion. While Chesterton's movement toward the church was not without some dangerous or complicating detours, his experience of evil also rang true to those sensibilities we call Catholic. That experience contributed in frighteningly practical ways to his understanding of the great moral and transcendent drama unfolding in all human life. The destiny of a soul, of course, is inescapably dramatic in itself, but it is also dramatic in the soul's history of innumerable, maybe miniature, moral conflicts conducted in an atmosphere of suspense and urgency. Chesterton was alive to all of this, but the experience of evil for him also sharply underscored man's moral freedom or liberty. The fact that one could, simply by a choice, so set himself against the of existence was terrifying. But it also spoke volumes about what it is to be human, to bear genuine thought. Indeed, they lie behind much of his thought, religious or no, including those gratuitous verbal romps or essays in which he sings the praises of cheese, or threatens to write epic poems about the contents of his pockets, or criticizes wallpaper patterns as clearly being in violation of Scripture's injunction against uttering vain repetitions. Think Victorian wallpaper and you'll know exactly what he means. And the first of these acute sensibilities lies so far behind or beneath the rest that it may be said to animate them all. And this is Chesterton's invariably outward mental bearing or disposition. Underwriting his imagination and his reasonings is a mind opened outward to a reality for which it was hungry. For all his apparent mental abstraction, Chesterton's particular sensitivities gave him a positive appetite for the real, for what is, we might say. He desired with desire, or gusto, the world he had not made. Perhaps this sounds ordinary, but in fact in our day, no less than his, it is rare. A moment's reflection reveals that people tend to be wary of the world, to approach it with something beyond prudent caution and more like preemptive resentment. Perhaps as a result of the fall, we generally regard reality as a thing to accept on conditions, or to engage rather grudgingly. The world seems stubborn, recalcitrant, uninclined to bend to our will. It represents a kind of permanent obstacle to be conquered and overcome. Creation, by which I mean everything, not just the natural world, we tend to regard with resistant suspicion. A tight-lipped "what now" characterizes much of man's posture towards being itself. Indeed, this tendency to regard reality as an unwieldy thing to be whipped into submission to our all-disposing will has only metastasized in the post-industrial, post-scientific revolutionary era. Ours is a day that will accept no amount of even material or physical reality as a given, but treats all reality up to and including our own bodies as an imposition subject to radical modification or alteration to suit our will. Chesterton's receptivity to reality, on the other hand, is precisely that quality, aside from being in contrast to this modern disposition. It also strikes many readers, not most, but many, as indicative of naivete or frivolity. He seems, to many modern readers, too ready to embrace a reality of which we are wary. Chesterton enjoyed the poetry of Robert Browning, and Browning's Last Duchess famously is described as liking whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. This is the crime Chesterton is sometimes accused of committing. That people should accuse so, should think him naive, is all the more remarkable because he is nothing, if not a controversialist, forever in the lists of argument. He was a man at odds with 1,000 things of his day. But in a sense, those who wrongly convict Chesterton of naivete rightly sense the quality of mind most unlike their own, his hunger for the given world. Behind all his political, cultural, and even religious wrangling, there is this radical openness to a reality he did not make, a world he could not have predicted, and an existence that he could not redefine at will. This is the first, and I think the most important, profound quality of Chesterton's mental posture that undergirds almost everything else about his thought and his attitudes. Like most profound qualities of mind, it is difficult to describe or capture, but this positive appetite for reality, rather than the more common reserved and wary suspicion of it, is closely related to another driving quality of Chesterton's understanding, and that is his love of and ferocious fidelity to the truth of things. This again perhaps sounds like something we ought to take for granted. Chesterton himself often treats the matter of truth in an, of course, fashion, as if knowledge or certitude about things is the universally presumed goal of thinking about them. But he knows too well that this is not the case. The world has taken an odd turn, and it has made doubt the only thing of which we can be certain. What we suffer from today, he writes in Orthodoxy, is humility in the wrong place. Modesty has moved from the organ of ambition. Modesty has settled upon the organ of conviction, where it was never meant to be. A man was meant to be doubtful about himself, but undoubting about the truth. This has been exactly reversed. In fact, Chesterton devotes an entire chapter of this most famous work, Orthodoxy, to the very problem of skepticism, calling it the suicide of thought. Under the guise of modesty, wide experience of the ways of the world, and fair-minded equanimity, the skeptical man aborts the fruit of thought and refrains from hazarding a truth. What was elsewhere formulated as a quip, I, Chesterton says, am incurably convinced that the object of opening the mind, as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid, receives in Orthodoxy an extended and revealing treatment. The peril is that the human intellect is free to destroy itself. Just as one generation could prevent the very existence of the next generation by all entering a monastery or jumping into the sea, so one set of thinkers can in some degree prevent further thinking by teaching the next generation that there is no validity in any human thought. The young skeptic says, I have a right to think for myself. But the old skeptic, the complete skeptic, says, I have no right to think for myself. I have no right to think at all. Chesterton then observes, there is a thought that stops thought. That is the only thought that ought to be stopped. Of course, Chesterton knows that to err is human, and that thinking is fraught with what Francis Bacon calls the idols of the mind. It is hampered by our passions, misled by our ignorance, and subject to our petty fanaticisms, hobby horses, and pride. It is so difficult to think anything through and get it right that Socrates in the Phaedo famously pauses in the midst of an argument to caution his colleagues against despair of the mind's ability to know. He calls it misology. Thought is a perilous business. Then, too, on the opposite side, the assertive, opinionated boor, the person whose first thought is his only thought, and every hill is a hill to die upon. This character, when it is not comical, is usually someone that people will flee rather than endure such a flood of ill-considered opinions. Of all of this, Chesterton is perfectly aware, but he remains far more concerned about the subtle, corrosive effect of skepticism upon the mind and upon the world than he is about false or overconfident reasoning. Interestingly, while he does point out the contradiction in skepticism, how can one be so sure that one cannot be sure? This does not really constitute the moral force of his arguments generally. Instead, he tends to decry the dehumanizing unreality of the idea. Skepticism is not just wrong, but it prevents the mind from ever being right. It removes from thought its purpose, object, and end. Bad though we may be at thinking, it is what we are meant to do in order to know, to arrive at truths beyond the mere impressions of sense. This is why skepticism is dehumanizing. Chesterton also relates skepticism to decadence and the senility of a civilization in exhausted decline. In part, he does so to chasten the hubris of smug progressivism. What if, instead of being superior to the past, a skeptical age instead is so far inferior it does not even recognize that it is lying on its own deathbed? But in part, too, he does so because he hopes to reverse, of course, the exhausted decline of the civilization he loves so well. For all its errors, Western civilization, that beleaguered thing, was born and sustained in its love for truth. To abandon that love is to die. Finally, Chesterton often paints the absurdity of skepticism, not so much from the point of view of logic again, as from the point of view of the ordinary human life. He does so with more subtlety, however, and suggestiveness than the phrase ordinary human life may imply. The ordinary man, he says, has always left himself free to doubt his gods, unlike the agnostic of today, free also, however, to believe in them. He has always cared more for truth than for consistency. If he saw two truths that seemed to contradict each other, he would take the two truths and the contradiction along with them. His spiritual sight is stereoscopic. Like his physical sight, he sees two different pictures at once and yet sees all the better for that. Thus, he has always believed there was such a thing as fate, but such a thing as free will also. Thus, he believed that children were indeed the kingdom of heaven, but nevertheless ought to be obedient to the kingdom of earth. He admired youth because it was young, and age because it was not. It is exactly this balance of apparent contradiction that has been the buoyancy of the healthy man. As this remark suggests, Chesterton is doing more here than defending the idea of truth, though he is certainly doing that. He is also giving the ordinary man credit for a quite sophisticated, I mean that in a good sense, a quite sophisticated or delicate capacity to grasp the truth of a thing, even in tension with other things. The man's readiness for truth is so acute, he will hold on to one even if he cannot fully account for its relation to other truths. This Chesterton calls mystery, and we'll discuss it more in a bit. But implicit here, too, is a critique of rather shallow but prevailing notions of what human reasoning is, how it works, and what kinds of rules it must obey. For all Bacon's criticism of the idols of the mind, his notions of proper empirical reasoning result centuries later in a desiccated scientism that Chesterton here and often exposes. Next to the ordinary man's robust desire to know, the skeptic's doubts and the rationalist's demands for absolute consistency come to look almost comically unreal. Of course, not all Chesterton's attacks on skepticism range widely and entail related things in history, science, or the destiny of a civilization. Sometimes he does thrust home the contradiction in logic, or round on the psychology of the skeptic. Probably his single most famous remark about this is found in what is otherwise a rather obscure essay on the Book of Job. There, Chesterton describes God as having routed all human skepticism with a higher skepticism. He goes on, "In dealing with the arrogant asserter of doubt, it is not the right method to tell him to stop doubting. It is rather the right method to tell him to go on doubting, to doubt a little more, to doubt every day newer and wilder things in the universe until, at last, by some strange enlightenment, he may begin to doubt himself." We might say, he may begin to doubt doubt itself. In his attacks on skepticism, both hard and soft, that is, skepticism as a philosophy and as a posture of presumed superiority over credulous ordinary people, Chesterton most clearly reveals his profound instinct for our being created to recognize the real. Ultimately, of course, this recognition reaches toward truth with an uppercase T. For Chesterton, however, the mind's susceptibility to reality, its capacity for knowledge or truth, is anything but a dry capacity for data storage or for the receipt of impressions. Any remotely adequate apprehension of the world, he insists, cannot help but recognize in it an irreducible romance. Now, this term, I know, is freighted with difficulties. Chesterton uses it in The Romance of Orthodoxy because with something like puckish mischievousness, Chesterton knows he will surprise readers and strike many as if with an oxymoron. In fact, Chesterton's romanticism may be his most misunderstood quality even by his admirers. He does not regard romance primarily as a matter of sentiment or emotion. He may use terms that resonate with the passions in describing the romance of reality, but he regards existence as imbued with romance simply as a matter of fact. The world, despite the presence of poison ivy, poor stock markets, or boring professors even, is shot through with meaning and gratuitous good that no one could expect or presume upon. It is both a surprise and a gift. This is not to say that Chesterton disregards the passions entirely. He does indeed think that a proper response to reality entails joy and exhilaration. But even here, the passions are not the object. Joy and exhilaration are the natural concomitants to an act of the intellect, wherein the magnanimity, gloriousness, and arresting splendor of existence are recognized. The passions signal that a great good has been encountered. For Chesterton, the romance of reality is not a subjective feeling, but a facet of existence itself, a good we participate in, recognize, and respond to accordingly. Chesterton's critics often mistake him for championing certain passions largely for their own sake. Ours is a pessimistic, distrustful age, and in that light, a propensity for joy looks like sentimentality or a damning refusal to acknowledge the evils of the world. When we see people criticizing Chesterton, as we do see, for woolly-headedness, for bombast or fuzzy enthusiasms, those rejections of joy and its cause really are ultimately responsible. The criticisms may be expressed as distaste for his prose style, his paradoxes, and his love of rhetorical retort. But almost always, not always, but almost always, the criticism is rooted in censure for the crime of being a romantic. Far from being a crime, however, Chesterton insists that this romance is nothing other than the West's own sensibility about life and being. The thing I propose to take as common ground, says Chesterton, between myself and any average reader is the desirability of an active and imaginative life, picturesque and full of poetical curiosity, a life such as Western man, at any rate, has always seemed to have desired. Nearly all people I have ever met in this Western society in which I live would agree to the general proposition that we need this life of practical romance, the combination of something that is strange with something that is secure. We need so to view the world as to combine an idea of wonder and an idea of welcome. Western civilization is an inherently romantic one, or at least was so, until burgeoning materialism and scientific habits of mind began to teach us to regard the world as a spiritless blob or lump operating in strict accord with mechanical laws. The world, in fact, retains its gratuity, strangeness, wonderfulness, or dare I say magic, but our susceptibility to these qualities may thrive or may suffer. He says, all the terms used in the science books, law, necessity, order, tendency, and so on, are really unintellectual because they assume an inner synthesis which we do not possess. The only words that ever satisfied me as describing nature are the terms used in the fairy books. Charm, spell, enchantment. They express the arbitrarity of the fact and its mystery. I deny altogether that this is fantastic or even mystical. The fairy tale language about things is simply rational and agnostic. What Chesterton means by this is that the language of science leads us to think that everything must be the way it is, which is false, while the language of fairy tales makes plain that what exists was or is in fact a choice, a decision, and a decree. It could have been otherwise, and why the Creator made the choices he did remains for us shrouded in mystery. As we have largely lost our ordinary sense of surprise and mystery at the universe, Chesterton considers it his task to reawaken us. His arresting comparisons and apparent hyperbole, for example, are not so much, I think, the author's unconscious stylistic habits as they are rhetorical means to the end of breaking through readers' drowsy stupor of the imagination. So too the examples he chooses deliberately reach toward common but often ignored experience. We all like astonishing tales because they touch the nerve of the ancient instinct of astonishment. This is proved by the fact that when we are very young children, we do not need fairy tales, we only need tales. Mere life is interesting enough. A child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon. But a child of 3 is excited by being told Tommy opened a door. Boys like romantic tales, but babies like realistic tales because they find them romantic. The object in the example is a form of Chesterton's own "unless ye be as little children." The capacity to recognize romance and to wonder at the world is not supposed to be confined to the very young. It is the vocation of all intelligent beings up to and including the angels. We, however, are jaded and asleep. Alas, he says, we all go on every day unless we are continually goading ourselves into gratitude and humility, seeing less and less of the significance of the sky or stones. And goad us Chesterton does, making the child the father of the man, so to speak, and providing a means for us to do so as well. We may, he urges, by fixing our attention almost fiercely on the facts actually before us, force them to turn into adventures, force them to give up their meaning and fulfill their mysterious purpose. Again, so much of Chesterton's work to reawaken readers to the wonders of reality, of existence and being, strikes modern ears as rather sentimentally motivated or directed. But the most important facet of almost all his remarks along these lines goes almost entirely unnoticed. He speaks of them as something like a matter of justice. Wonder and gratitude are not commended primarily because they are appealing subjective experiences, as in a good time will be had by all, but rather because reality deserves them. Wonder, he says, has a positive element of praise, and praise is a matter of deserving. Give reality its due. The not too hidden implication, of course, is that there is some one to praise for all these wonders. Chesterton confesses that as a child he felt enormous gratitude, but scarcely knew to whom. While he has great sympathy for pagan impulses, more so than for modern insensibility, he's of course not suggesting that we hop around shrubbery singing its glory and draping it with sacrificial offerings. Rather, we are to search out the object, the person, to whom we should direct our gratitude and praise. When he remarks that the world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder, we again see the element of justice, of deserving, even if Chesterton's point here is more a lament for its absence. That justice should be Chesterton's plea in all this should not be surprising. Given what we have already seen as to the objective good of reality itself, of its gratuitous character, Chesterton will appeal to our natural sense of what is right or just when confronting this truth. The passions, indeed, are included in this as well, as justice is done, or at least is accompanied, by the movement of wonder and gratitude. Ours has been called a therapeutic age. We move in a sea of self-help advice, focused on feelings, self-esteem, well-being, and now self-care. The result of this is that we easily misunderstand the relation between subjective states and objective realities that authors like Chesterton invoke. Chesterton might wonder if this flood of material in pursuit of good feeling was a case of methinks they doth protest too much. In other words, that ours must be the most miserable of ages if it talks about happiness so incessantly. But he would not wonder at the cause of this misery, nor would he even scorn the era for thrashing about restlessly, looking for peace. He would instead most likely direct us to the objective truths to which he dedicated his life to describing, and rely then on human nature to bring about the healthful and happy result that is wonder and gratitude. Toward the end of his autobiography, he looks back over his life and identifies what he hopes it is not pompous to call the chief idea of my life. I will not say the doctrine that I have always taught, but the doctrine I should always have liked to teach, and that is the idea of taking things with gratitude and not taking things for granted. For all the clumsy paraphrases of Chesterton's thought here, it could fairly be argued that nothing is necessarily or even specifically Catholic. The experience of evil, love of reality in itself, recognition of wonder and gratitude as proper concomitants to the gift of being, all this may be well and good, but it does not equate with or specify particularly Catholic things. Compatibility with the faith is not the faith itself. What about them illuminates the Catholic mind of Chesterton? Or to take another step, what about them extends beyond Chesterton and reaches toward the Catholic mind rather than simply his or a Catholic mind? Allow me to address this in an initially indirect way, but one which I hope soon comes home. In 2008, a writer for The New Yorker published in that magazine a lengthy article about Chesterton upon the 100th anniversary of The Man Who Is Thursday. The article ranged broadly, not confined to that early novel, but it was especially appreciative of Chesterton's earlier work, while lamenting a supposed decline in Chesterton's later, more Catholic writings. It quotes Thursday's romantic detective Syme thus: "Listen to me," cried Syme with extraordinary emphasis. "Shall I tell you the secret of the whole world? It is that we have only known the back of the world. We see everything from behind, and it looks brutal. That is not a tree, but the back of a tree. That is not a cloud, but the back of a cloud. Cannot you see that everything is stopping and hiding a face? If we could only get round in front." The article comments, "Given that longing, it was as obvious that Chesterton was headed to Rome as it was that Oscar Wilde was heading to Reading Jail. If you want a solution, at once authoritarian and poetic, to the threat of anarchism, Catholicism, which built Chartres and inspired Dante, looks a lot better than Scotland Yard. If you want stability allied to imagination, Catholicism has everything else beat. Well, one appreciates the reference to art, Dante, poetry, and the imagination. I could, however, perhaps comment on the interesting use of the word authoritarian instead of authoritative, or the unsavory parallel drawn with Wilde. Yet the author's suggestion is a common one, and though false, remains an image of something true. Chesterton does not approach the faith as a solution to a problem, unless by solution we mean the same thing Chesterton did by saying he became Catholic in order to get rid of his sins. The article means solution, uses that word, means solution, in that suggestively psychological sense. The problem entails a kind of anxiety, however wrapped up in intellectual formulation, that submission to Rome solves. Well, as experience proves, that just does not work. People who seek peace in the truth find that peace in the church. People who seek a solution for anxiety there, however, are often frustrated. The church saves souls, not therapy bills. The author continues and refers to Chesterton's use of a commonplace, particularly a puppet show, a man with a golden key in a puppet show, as intimating something about eternity. This is that article. The desire for mystery and romance can't be argued out of importance, but it can't be willed into existence either. It is a mistake to believe that the man with the golden key is only a puppet when he acts out a story that alters the inside of your head. It is also a mistake to cover your eyes and wish away the strings. This latter mistake presumably is Chesterton's. We can take the belief in that puppet to be a delusion, as the rationalists did, or we can take it to be an intimation, as Chesterton did, of the existence of another world in which the things that we sense as shadows will become real and we will see ourselves as puppets that have come alive in the hand of God. Or, and now here he commends his own view, or we can believe that the credit we give the puppet show is the credit it deserves, that the wonder of it cannot be explained up or down, but only experienced, that the side we see is the side there is to look at, and that the white radiance of wonder shines from the inside, which is where the light is. That is, he says, the wonder of the puppet show is real, but comes from within us, without intimating anything of the transcendent. There is no back of the world that we view in lieu of the front. The world is the front, period. The author is clearly intelligent, and as they say, it's a point of view. He has many sympathies with Chesterton and a great deal of apparent goodwill. Nevertheless, Chesterton has already anticipated just this kind of argument that suspends the mind's natural desire to know. The author says of wonder that it cannot be explained up toward heaven or down as if it does not matter. All one can do is experience it and leave it at that. For Chesterton, this just won't do for being made to think. This is Chesterton now. The first thing the casual critic will say is, "What nonsense all this is. Do you mean that a poet cannot be thankful for grass and wild flowers without connecting it with theology, let alone your theology?" To which I answer, yes, I mean he cannot do it without connecting it to theology, unless he can do it without connecting it with thought. And later, and if it be next asked, why this theology, I will answer here, because it is the only theology that has not only thought, but thought of everything. For all the author's steely rejection of Chesterton's romantic, transcendent intimations, it is he, not Chesterton, who unplugs feeling from thought and settles for feeling. It is he who opts for the abortive experience of wonder, as if the passions are their own end, in an experience bounded by a quiet despair of mind, thought, and transcendence. And this is why things so apparently non-religious, like romance, wonder, gratitude, love of reality, and the mind's capacity to know, take us to Chesterton's Catholic mind, and even to the Catholic mind. It is a metaphysical version of all roads leading to Rome. Drop these realities, experiences, or sensibilities into a mind in motion, and unless there is some forced halt, some fearful pulling back, some refusal to do what the mind naturally does, think, you will not only find yourself thinking theology, but thinking the theology that has thought of everything. Of course, reality is messy, motives are mixed, prejudices and pride impede thought everywhere. But even in our fallen state, given enough time, goodwill, and persistence in thinking things through, one will find oneself on the porch step of faith. Excuse me. And as Chesterton noted, once there, you will find that even that result has been thought of already. We end then where we began, where romance, gratitude, wonder, and reality itself seem to abound. I mean, of course, in Dickens. Father Schall points to the conclusion of Chesterton's book on Dickens as showing his, Chesterton's, almost unique understanding among the moderns of the link between this world and the next to be found in ordinary, commonplace things. He quotes Chesterton thus, "We have a long way to get back to what Dickens meant, that comradeship and serious joy are not interludes in our travel, but rather our travels are interludes in comradeship and joy, which, through God, shall endure forever." Friendship is the particular good Father Schall and Chesterton reference here, and of course no higher thing could be chosen. The great Micawber himself, for all his trials and flaws, stands like a minor deity embodying friendship, festivity, and joy. But the logic of such goods is not confined to them. All the goods of this life, romantic and real, green grass, pale moons, even puppet theaters and pubs, are ends, as well as roads or paths for rational souls to travel toward their ultimate end. Father Schall makes sure to include Chesterton's closing lines to just that effect. The inn does not point to the road points to the inn, and all roads point at last to an ultimate inn, where we shall meet Dickens and all his characters, and when we drink again, it shall be from the great flagons in the taverns at the end of the world. No, Chesterton does not believe we will meet fictional characters in heaven. Rather, he reminds us that every good, even an imaginary one, is freighted with ultimate, real meaning that points to an ultimate, real end. And that end is very, very good. Thank you. Or questions and evasions. This is Washington, isn't it?
I was wondering if you had any observations on his appreciation of the visual arts, and in particular sacred art, and the early influence. He would have only seen the early influence of modernism on sacred art in the Catholic Church.
Ooh, very good. There may be people in this room, you may be one of them, expert in that very subject. But I can say a few things. Chesterton was extremely wary of what we now call modernism in art. He was wary, he was suspicious, especially in its literary expressions. He made some rather remarkable fun of modernism. There are some poems he wrote in imitation of contemporary to him poetry, and he likens a mailbox to a screaming infant. If you think of the early 20th century English mailbox, it's this red pillar with a slot at the top. And he says, you know, I've never really noticed that that looks like a screaming infant, but if you say so. So he makes fun of it in some contexts. When it comes to the visual arts, Chesterton was not just a commentator, but a practitioner. When he left St. Paul's, he went to the Slade Art School, and I don't think he had completed a course of study there, but he was what we would call a cartoonist. But those cartoons, I mean, who among us wouldn't love to have those on the wall? He was quite gifted, quite talented, and even his napkin doodles are delightful. So he had a large soft spot for the visual arts in particular. He was not what some might call a hidebound traditionalist when it comes to visual arts. Certainly he was not an abstract modernist, but he was a patron of people like Eric Gill and others who were sculpting in a modernistically influenced way. They were, in fact, I think Eric Gill carved Chesterton's tombstone. And if you see those figures, those relief figures, you can see a kind of, I don't want to say, it would be unjust to say Art Deco, right? But you can see that early 20th century quality that is still representative, still proportionate, and has a grace, but has not retreated into pure abstraction, not even close. I think Chesterton would resist pure abstraction because of his love of the world. I mean, why leave behind the good of wood and man-made things and trees and the world? Why leave that entirely behind in attempts to express a kind of chaotic interior world? So he had sympathies with some elements of artistic pictorial modernism, but certainly not where it went.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about Chesterton's views on aesthetics. So we have plenty of books, and you said many of the most famous ones about his views against relativism in the realms of truth, of knowledge, and morality. But also in the modern day, there is also a huge tendency of relativism towards beauty, beauty that of the beholder. How would Chesterton engage with those modern perspectives in favor of objective beauty?
The first thing he would do is joke, right? The first thing he would say, well, I certainly hope beauty is in the eye of the beholder, because if it were in the earlobe or the kneecap, it wouldn't do much good there. So he would probably, and his joke would be much better than that, of course. But what Chesterton would he does not believe, he understands that the experience of beauty is in a person, in what a philosopher would call a knowing subject. It is people who experience beauty, and that is an experience. But what he would resist, he would fight mightily, is the idea, is two things, and one of which was intimated in that talk. He would fight mightily the idea that beauty was arbitrary and unconnected with any objective goods in the thing beheld. In other words, there was an objective reality in beauty. There are things that are objectively, the beauty of which is objectively real, okay? And that we are we're made to experience that beauty. And in fact, what he would say then too is that the pleasure entailed in the experience of beauty is, again, not the end or the object of beauty, but rather the flag or the signal that beauty has been encountered. And see, that's the fundamental modern and indeed relativistic mistake in thinking that aren't we all just pursuing pleasure? So this is beautiful to me, it gives me pleasure, so this is beauty. Chesterton would say, whether or not that gives you pleasure might be an interesting conversation, but the link of pleasure to the objective reality of beauty is what is important in recognizing that one has encountered a real good. If I can put that in a nutshell, it would be beauty is objectively real. The pleasure we experience when seeing it is our indication that we've bumped into it. I don't know if that's adequate, but that's what I think you would probably aim toward.
I'm going to take one more question. This gentleman.
You talked about Chesterton's critique of skepticism, and I wanted to ask if you thought that that was still a widespread problem in the world, because at least from my experience, I have a lot of atheist friends who sort of unquestionably accept a secular dogma that tells them what to think on everything.
Right. It's perfectly Chestertonian, right? Because it's a paradox. How can a world steeped in a kind of deep despair of the mind's ability to really know anything be so dogmatic about everything? But it is. It turns out that skepticism is actually a porch step of dogmatism, and I mean of a bad sort, of course. Because what happens, not to engage in psychobabble, but people who are profoundly skeptical will often respond by when you ramp down the intellect, you ramp up the will. So the intellect's ability to actually cognize the real, wrap itself around what is, when that is diminished, when that is lost, what happens is will steps in, if I can use awkward analogs, will steps into the vacuum. And that's why people become especially dogmatic, especially pushy, especially insistent in a highly skeptic and relativistic age. Now, that said, it's also the case that a lot of people don't really recognize their own skepticism. They think of themselves as perfectly happy with the truth of things, and the truth of things is exactly co-equal to everything that resides in my head. In other words, I'm infallible and the rest of the world is an idiot. That's actually a form of skepticism, because that infallibility is, again, reposing on will, not any sort of robust confidence in man's intellectual capacity, right? It's a robust confidence in me. Do you see the difference? Do you see what I mean? Perhaps I'm just too pessimistic, but I really think we're no less skeptical, we're no less relativistic, but we're a lot louder and more obnoxious. So.
I think, so we are going to close out. That was the penultimate question. This is the final question and answer from Professor Hadley Argus.
David, that was so good that I want to tell Cindy to take my name off the list to do a successor talk. While you were going on, I was just trying to, lines were coming back. So my favorite lines bearing Chesterton on religion. 3 spring to mind. I'll just offer them up, and you could ask you to do a riff on any one of them. First, say Chesterton saying, animals have no religious sense. When was the last time you heard of a cow giving up grass on Fridays? Or those who love some part of Catholicism more than they love Catholicism itself. They'll affirm the spirit and shun the body. They said if they take themselves off into the desert and they worship that peaceful, as if it were the whole thing. And if they're wise men, they call themselves fools. And if they're fools, they call themselves progressive evolutionists. And the last one is that the church has never said on behalf of democracy what Mr. Jefferson has said, that all men are created equal. That it will be the rendering of all civic peace before the church will ever say that life of that moron is not worth saving.
Excellent. Very good. Well, I won't riff off of any of them, except to say this. You know that one moment when Chesterton, I read, he says the theology has thought, it's not just thought, it's thought everything. What really does that mean? What that means is what you just said. That is, the church, the church seems to have anticipated all the ways we could go wrong before we went wrong. thinking the life of a moron was without value. That before we started debating those eugenic or abortive sort of policies, the church had been there forever. Before we, you mentioned the body. Before people in East and in the West, there seems to be this pendulum, right? Of we tend to our own harm. We want to despise either the flesh or the spirit. One or the other always seems to be coming in for trouble, right? You know, and the church, before we started doing that, the church was, no, don't go that far. No, don't go that far on the other side. So reject the body and you're going to be in trouble. And the church will have predicted that. Reject the spirit and you're going to be in trouble. And the church has predicted. That's what he means by it's thought of everything. It's not that it has a rule about everything. That's the caricature of Catholicism, right? You know, it's got all these rules. It's that it knows what a person is. And so it can say, you know, if you act like you have 17 toes, your shoes will never really fit. And you know, if you act like you don't or shouldn't have a body, you'll never really have and et cetera, et cetera. So I think what you've done is given several wonderful, not surprisingly wonderful, selected examples of Chesterton articulating the way in which the church has thought of all those things before, again, we even got around to being curious about them. All right, well, thank you. Thank you all.
Reception outside. Also, we do have a number of Chesterton and Father Schall books by our register. Thank you very much. Our next session will be here at the CIC. Will be on Thursday, January 30th. It's called American Priest: The Ambitious Life and Concluded Legacy of Notre Dame's Father Ted Hesburgh. Yes,
Yeah.